At the height of the Cold War, when fear sat quietly in every living room and nations learned to measure their power not in miles, but in minutes to impact, a silent race began in the upper atmosphere. It was a race no one ever saw, because the machines competing in it flew too high, too fast, and too secretly for ordinary eyes. Yet one fact became clear long before the world ever learned its name. To control the skies, you must first outrun them. This was the moment when the United States made a decision that would reshape aviation forever. A decision born not from ambition, but from terror. In 1960, when Francis Gary Powers' U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union, Washington was forced to face an uncomfortable truth. America's most advanced reconnaissance aircraft was now too slow, too predictable, and too vulnerable. The CIA could no longer depend on altitude alone to protect its pilots. The Soviets were watching the sky with increasingly sophisticated radars, and their surface-to-air missiles were no longer theoretical threats. They worked. They reached. They killed. Something extraordinary had to replace the U-2, and fast. The task fell to a quiet group of engineers hidden in the California desert, a place that would become legendary. Skunk Works, the advanced development branch of Lockheed. And at its head, Clarence Kelly Johnson, a man whose genius was matched only by his stubborn refusal to accept the word impossible. Johnson was not simply designing an airplane, he was trying to outrun the future. The project was given a name that sounded almost biblical: Archangel. It began with early concepts like A-1 and A-2, evolving rapidly as the CIA demanded greater speed, higher ceilings, and radar signatures so low that Soviet operators would see, at best, a flicker, a ghost, a momentary glitch. Every requirement was an engineering nightmare. Every solution broke another rule of aerodynamics. By the time the team reached the 11th design, A-11, it became clear that something unprecedented was emerging. The 12th revision would change history. That machine was the A-12. To the few people who knew of it, the aircraft looked like it had come from another planet. A dagger-shaped fuselage. Enormous engine nacelles stretched along the wings like black monoliths, and a titanium skin that, during high-speed flight, heated to temperatures that would melt traditional aircraft aluminum. At more than 3 times the speed of sound and altitudes around 80,000 feet, the A-12 would live in a world where air behaved like a fluid wall and every component fought for survival against friction, heat, and physics itself. Titanium was essential, yet almost impossible to obtain. The United States quietly purchased the metal through third-party companies, many of which sourced it from the Soviet Union. In a twist of Cold War irony, the USSR supplied the materials that would eventually help the CIA spy on them. From 1959 to 1962, the A-12 took shape in secrecy so deep that even the U.S. Air Force initially doubted the program's value. But the CIA pushed forward, convinced that speed and altitude were the only shields left against Soviet defenses. When the first A-12 prototype lifted off from the Nevada desert in April 1962, witnesses described it as impossible. A plane that looked too sharp, too elongated, too alien to be real. Rumors spread among nearby towns that something extraterrestrial had taken to the skies above Area 51. People weren't entirely wrong. The A-12 operated at conditions bordering on spaceflight. The machine was mesmerizing not only for aviation enthusiasts, but also for generals and politicians who saw in it a new kind of weapon, not one that destroyed cities, but one that prevented wars by uncovering their secrets. Still, the CIA's crown jewel had a problem. It was never meant to be built in small numbers. Johnson knew that a program of this scale could not survive without Air Force support. So even as the A-12 advanced, Lockheed quietly worked on derivative designs aimed at appealing to the Pentagon. The idea was bold: create a family of aircraft, each variant serving a different strategic purpose. By the early 1960s, proposals multiplied: interceptors, bombers, mixed-role reconnaissance platforms. The Air Force initially dismissed them, clinging to its own projects. But once they saw the A-12 fly, skepticism turned into hunger. They wanted a version of their own, something with longer range, better endurance, and equipment tailored to military operations rather than CIA intelligence gathering. And so, from a classified CIA project, a new branch of the Archangel lineage began to grow, one that would ultimately produce the most iconic aircraft of the entire Cold War. But before it received its final, unforgettable name, SR-71 Blackbird, it existed only as a series of tense meetings, secret contracts, and technical battles fought in desert hangars under fluorescent light. What emerged from those shadows was more than a plane. It was a promise that the United States would not be caught off guard again. A technological leap so dramatic that even today, half a century later, its numbers still look unreal. This was the beginning. The moment the world unknowingly stepped into the supersonic age of strategic reconnaissance. The rivalry that shaped the SR-71 did not begin in the sky. It began in conference rooms filled with cigarette smoke, suspicion, and two institutions that, despite working for the same country, rarely wanted the same thing: the CIA and the United States Air Force. Both understood the stakes of the Cold War. Both wanted control over strategic reconnaissance. And both believed they alone should define the future of high-altitude intelligence gathering. The A-12 had proven something extraordinary. A manned aircraft could outfly radar networks and surface-to-air missiles. It was not invisible, but it was faster and higher than anything the Soviets could reliably challenge. For the CIA, the A-12 was perfect: secret, small, and built for pinpoint covert missions. For the Air Force, it was something else entirely: a threat to their domain. They had always managed reconnaissance operations. Why should the agency suddenly operate a machine capable of flying 3 times faster than their best interceptors? As the A-12 entered testing, military leadership pressured Lockheed to adapt the aircraft into something of their own. So began a subtle yet ruthless political maneuver: turn the success of the CIA's Archangel into a broader family of aircraft and make the Air Force dependent on it. Kelly Johnson, never one to waste an opportunity, responded with a cascade of design proposals. Some were wildly ambitious: long-range strike platforms, high-speed bombers, deep penetration reconnaissance hybrids. Others were refinements of the A-12 concept, stretched or reshaped to meet military expectations. The Air Force initially dismissed many of these ideas, clinging to its own troubled projects like the North American XF-108 Rapier, an interceptor so costly and complex it died before leaving the ground. But Lockheed kept pushing. They demonstrated that the A-12 airframe could be modified into something even more capable: a twin-seat interceptor called the YF-12, armed with air-to-air missiles and designed to counter the looming Soviet bomber threat. When the Air Force witnessed the YF-12 reach Mach 3, their resistance began to crack. Suddenly, Archangel was no longer a CIA toy. It was a potential weapon system, something powerful, something fast enough to defend the continental United States. The Pentagon took notice. Congressional committees took notice. And most importantly, the generals took notice. The turning point arrived in late 1962. After months of negotiations, political pressure, and internal debate, the Air Force signed a contract with Lockheed to develop a long-range strategic reconnaissance aircraft based on the A-12. The plane would be tailored not for covert agency missions, but for global military surveillance: longer flights, improved sensors, better endurance, and a second crew member to operate sophisticated equipment. Lockheed's internal designation for it was R-12. The military initially called it RS-71, reconnaissance strike, because someone, somewhere, still hoped it could carry weapons. But history often turns on small mistakes, and the most famous designation in aviation history was born from one. On July 25, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson stepped to a podium and revealed the existence of a new aircraft. While reading his prepared statement, he announced the name as SR-71, reversing the RS by accident, or perhaps not entirely by accident. General Curtis LeMay, one of the most influential figures in the Air Force, had made his preference very clear. SR sounded better, more natural, more explicitly tied to the role of a strategic reconnaissance aircraft. Whether it was a genuine slip or a subtle political push, the result was irreversible. Lockheed didn't complain. The Air Force didn't complain. And so, SR-71 became official. The public believed they were witnessing the debut of an entirely new aircraft. But in truth, the announcement only scratched the surface. President Johnson never mentioned the A-12. He never acknowledged the 2-year head start the CIA already had. He never spoke of the deeply classified operations or the pilots flying out of Groom Lake. The A-12 remained invisible for another 2 decades, hidden behind layers of secrecy so thick that even many senior officers remained unaware of its existence. Inside Lockheed, however, the distinction was obvious. The SR-71 would not simply be an A-12 with a second cockpit. It needed greater range, greater expansion room for future sensors, redesigned inlets, reinforced structural members, a completely reworked nose section, larger Chinese, heavier fuel capacity. The list grew longer and longer until the aircraft, though sharing its lineage, became a fundamentally new creation. It would be heavier, nearly 50% heavier. It would be longer, almost 2 meters longer. It would carry more equipment than any reconnaissance aircraft before it. But even as engineers refined the design and specialists debated flight envelopes, Lockheed faced a stark reality. The Air Force was only half satisfied. They wanted an operational aircraft, yes, but they wanted it on their terms, not as a borrowed CIA derivative. The two institutions clashed repeatedly over access, budgets, technical authority, and deployment strategy. At times, the rivalry nearly destabilized the entire program. Yet the Blackbird was too promising to abandon. It represented something rare, a machine capable of outrunning politics, outpacing missiles, and outperforming the very technology meant to destroy it. And the Cold War was intensifying by the month. Soviet radar systems were improving. Their missile designs were evolving. Aircraft like the MiG-25 were beginning to take shape. The intelligence gap was widening again, and America needed an answer, one faster, more capable, and more adaptable than anything that had flown before. The SR-71 became that answer, but its rise was not only a battle of engineering. It was a battle of bureaucracies, egos, and institutions, each struggling to claim ownership of a machine that still existed only on paper and in wind tunnel models. The Air Force saw the future. The CIA saw a threat to its autonomy. And Lockheed saw the opportunity to create the most advanced aircraft the world had ever known. What emerged from this struggle was not simply a successor to the A-12. It was a new symbol of American power, one forged from rivalry, secrecy, and necessity. The Blackbird was coming, and the world would never look at the sky the same way again. The first time engineers saw the full-scale mock-up of what would become the SR-71, they understood one thing instantly. This aircraft was no longer an evolution of the A-12. It was something far more ambitious, far more complex, and far more unforgiving. The A-12 had been a masterpiece of its time, But the SR-71 demanded an entirely different level of engineering, even by the standards of Skunk Works, where impossible projects were the norm. The most striking change was its size. The SR-71 would be nearly 2 meters longer, with a broader, more muscular forward fuselage and enlarged Chinese that created additional lift at high speeds. These extended Chinese were not just aerodynamic flourishes. They made the aircraft more stable, more maneuverable, and, critically, provided space for the vast array of sensors, cameras, and electronic intelligence equipment the Air Force required. Inside the hangars at Burbank, engineers battled a long list of new constraints. The Air Force wanted greater range and the ability to carry more fuel. But more fuel meant more weight. More weight meant more heat. And more heat meant rethinking almost every structural element. When the redesign was finally complete, the SR-71 weighed nearly 50% more than the A-12. It became, in every measurable sense, a different aircraft. The challenge of heat was the enemy of everything. Metal, wiring, windows, fuel lines, sensor packages, even the paint. At Mach 3+, the SR-71 skin would warm to 300-400 degrees, 570, 750 degrees. Some areas, like the leading edges, could spike even higher. Traditional aircraft aluminum would soften like butter. Titanium was the only viable option. But titanium does not behave like aluminum. It cracks under stress. It resists machining. It contaminates easily. It demands new tools, new welding techniques, new inspection standards. Many of the workers at Lockheed had to be trained from scratch because no one on Earth had ever built an aircraft with this much titanium before. Entire supply chains had to be created. Even the screws, rivets, and fuel lines required redesigning. And all of this was just to keep the aircraft from warping itself apart in flight. The legendary J-5 Gate engine. Yet perhaps the greatest challenge came from the engines. The SR-71 would use Pratt & Whitney J58, an engineering marvel capable of a sustained cruise at Mach 3.2. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in the world, and calling the J58 an engine barely does it justice, because at high speed, it operated more like a hybrid between a turbojet and a ramjet. Below Mach 2, the afterburning turbojet provided most of the thrust. Above Mach 2.2, the inlet shock system began taking over. By Mach 3, the airflow bypassed much of the turbojet core entirely. The engine transitioned into a quasi-ramjet, with more than 80% of its thrust produced not by the rotating compressor blades, but by the pressure wave inside the inlet. This was a level of propulsion sophistication decades ahead of its era, but it also meant the SR-71 behaved like no other aircraft. A small misalignment in the inlet spike could cause the engine to unstart, a violent loss of shockwave control that slammed the aircraft sideways as if hit by an invisible hammer. Pilots described it as being kicked by a giant. Fixing an unstart at Mach 3 was not a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival. Fuel, fire, and the strange problem of leaks. The SR-71's specialized fuel, JP7, was another engineering response to heat. Regular jet fuel would evaporate or detonate under the temperatures the Blackbird experienced. JP7 was extremely stable, so stable that it required a pyrophoric chemical, triethylborane, TEB, to ignite. Every engine start produced a distinctive bright green flash, one of the Blackbird's most famous signatures. But JP7 brought its own complication. It leaked. Not because the tanks were poorly built, but because the SR-71's titanium fuselage expanded by several inches during flight. On the ground, seams intentionally left loose would ooze fuel. Only once the aircraft heated up in the sky would the structure expand enough to become nearly leak-proof. This strange characteristic forced an unusual flight routine. The aircraft would take off with partial tanks and immediately rendezvous with a KC-135Q tanker to fully refuel before beginning its mission. The two-seat revolution. The decision to add a second cockpit may seem small, but it changed everything. Behind the pilot sat the reconnaissance systems officer, the RSO, responsible for managing sensors, countermeasures, cameras, and navigation. To accommodate him, engineers removed the A-12's main equipment bay and replaced it with a pressure-tight cockpit. This meant they had to relocate, redesign, or miniaturize almost every onboard instrument. The Air Force demanded modular payload bays, removable nose sections, and swappable sensor pallets. The SR-71 ended up with 11 internal equipment bays, each capable of housing a wide range of reconnaissance systems. Infrared cameras, high-resolution optical cameras, side-looking radar, ELINT receivers. You could strip one out and install another in hours. This was unprecedented flexibility for the 1960s. The electronics that guided a lightning bolt. Some of the SR-71 systems bordered on science fiction. The most iconic was its astro-inertial navigation system, derived from missile technology. A small window behind the RSO allowed an internal telescope to track stars, even in daylight, and continually update the aircraft's position with extraordinary accuracy. After Star Wars debuted, crews jokingly nicknamed the unit R2-D2, but its ability to guide an aircraft at Mach 3 across thousands of miles of hostile airspace was no joke. The SR-71 also carried one of the most advanced defensive electronic warfare suites of its time, capable of jamming, deceiving, or confusing enemy radars across multiple frequency bands. Its sensing equipment could detect missile launches, radar locks, and tracking attempts long before they posed a threat. The black skin painted a deep midnight blue that appeared black at altitude. The SR-71's coating was far more than a cosmetic choice. The mixture contained iron ferrets that helped dissipate heat, reduce radar return, and protect the aircraft's skin. Even its color played a role in radiating away the extreme temperatures encountered at speed. By the time the first SR-71 rolled out, the differences from the A-12 were so profound that even veteran engineers admitted the two aircraft shared more philosophy than hardware. The Blackbird was not simply bigger or faster, it was engineered for a broader mission, a wider world, and a deeper reach into hostile airspace. The SR-71 was, in essence, a second generation of an aircraft that already belonged to the future. It stood as a machine built not for comfort, not for grace, but for survival in a realm where few things built by human hands could endure. And it was ready, not just to fly, but to explore the very limits of the possible. The SR-71 entered service with an aura of invincibility, but its early years proved that even a machine born from brilliance must earn its reputation the hard way. When the first operational Blackbirds arrived at Beale Air Force Base in 1966, the men assigned to fly and maintain them quickly realized they were stepping into a world no training manual had prepared them for. This was not an airplane that tolerated mistakes. It demanded precision, discipline, and a kind of nerve that few possessed. A difficult beginning. The first challenge was simply learning how to keep the aircraft alive. The SR-71 required more maintenance hours per flight hour than any aircraft before it. Titanium panels expanded unpredictably, seals warped, fuel lines had to be inspected constantly. Nearly every system operated at the edge of what 1960s technology could reliably support. Early unstarts, those violent disruptions of engine airflow, were so common that pilots learned to anticipate them the way sailors anticipate sudden storms at sea. Ground crews endured their own battles. They worked in temperatures that reached 60 degrees inside hangars, contending with fuel that seemed to leak just enough to test their patience, but never enough to be considered a failure. Specialized tools, equipment, and even uniforms were required. Nothing about the Blackbird could be maintained normally. And yet, despite the challenges, a dedicated corps of technicians emerged, people who treated the aircraft as something between a puzzle and a living thing. Losses and lessons. The SR-71's mythos often overshadows its darker moments, but the early period was marked by tragedy. Mechanical failures, especially engine issues, claimed multiple aircraft in the late 1960s. Unstarts were not just uncomfortable, they were lethal. At Mach 3, a sudden yaw could rip control surfaces apart or send the aircraft into a dive faster than the crew could react. Several Blackbirds were lost this way, including aircraft that broke apart before the crew could safely eject. Night missions brought their own dangers. One aircraft was lost after the crew misjudged spatial orientation. Another went down after a flameout at extremely high altitude, giving the pilots almost no time to recover. The fact that most incidents occurred without enemy interference underscored a sobering truth. The SR-71's greatest adversary was the SR-71 itself. Yet each disaster pushed the program forward. Engine control systems were refined. Inlet geometry was improved. Training became more rigorous. The aircraft slowly grew safer, not safe, but safer. By the early 1970s, Blackbird crews had gained the confidence needed to take it into hostile skies, into combat zones. The first true operational test came during the Vietnam War. In 1968, SR-71s deployed to Okinawa, joining the last remaining A-12s. The Blackbird couldn't hide its arrival. The locals noticed its shape and color immediately. They began calling it Habu, after a venomous snake native to the island. The name stuck, and crews embraced it. Vietnamese air defenses wasted no time. Radar operators locked onto the SR-71 constantly, attempting to track and target the aircraft. By war's end, hundreds of missiles had been fired, SA-2 guideline interceptors streaking upward in bright arcs, each one an attempt to kill the fastest operational aircraft in the world. None succeeded. The SR-71's altitude and speed allowed it to outrun even the best Soviet-designed systems deployed in Vietnam. Missile crews often described the experience as firing at a ghost, a target that appeared briefly on radar, then vanished before intercept solutions could be calculated. Even when missiles were launched blind, the Blackbird simply accelerated and left the threat behind. Crews did not take this for granted. They felt the pressure waves of explosions far below. They monitored their instruments with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They knew that survival depended less on evasive maneuvers and more on precise adherence to the aircraft's performance envelope. Europe and the Cold War front from RAF Mildenhall in England, SR-71s conducted missions along the borders of the Warsaw Pact. They flew parallel to Soviet airspace, gathering electronic intelligence, photographing troop movements, and mapping new installations. The aircraft almost never crossed into Soviet territory. This was a political choice, not a technical necessity. Soviet forces treated the Blackbird with a mixture of frustration and fascination. By the early 1970s, the USSR had deployed the MiG-25, a high-speed interceptor theoretically capable of challenging the SR-71. But reaching the Blackbird was one thing, catching it was another. MiG-25 pilots often managed to climb to interception altitude only to watch the SR-71 streak past at speeds and heights they could not match. There were moments of tension. Soviet radar crews learned to track the SR-71's distinctive signature. Interceptors were occasionally launched in calculated attempts to predict its flight path. Yet each time, the Blackbird simply outran them. The elegant simplicity of its defense strategy became legendary among pilots. If you're shot at, accelerate. Unexpected allies. One of the most surprising incidents occurred over the Baltic Sea when an SR-71 suffered an engine failure and was forced to descend. With speed dropping and Soviet forces alerted, the aircraft became vulnerable for the first time. But instead of a hostile reception, Swedish interceptors were the first to reach it. Understanding the geopolitical stakes, they escorted the Blackbird away from potential danger, an extraordinary moment of Cold War cooperation seldom discussed today. The Middle East and beyond. The SR-71 saw continuous use throughout the Middle East, monitoring conflicts such as the Arab-Israeli wars. Its ability to provide near real-time intelligence gave U.S. leadership an unparalleled view into unfolding crises. Nations aware of its overflights often reacted with frustration but lacked the means to stop it. It also supported operations over North Korea, mapping missile facilities and tracking troop deployments. The aircraft's presence was a constant reminder that even the most closed societies could not fully hide from a machine moving faster than their defenses could think. Records, endurance, and the outer edge of performance. As its operational tempo grew, so did its list of world records. The Blackbird shattered dozens: speed, altitude, time to climb, and cross-continental transit times that still stand today. It flew from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in just over an hour. It crossed the Atlantic in under 2. And during long-duration missions, it remained aloft for more than 10 hours, refueling multiple times as it traced thousands of miles across the globe. But these feats came at a cost. Blackbird crews endured temperatures, pressures, and physical stresses unlike any other aviation experience. Cockpits felt more like spacecraft than aircraft. Flight suits resembled those worn by astronauts, and the knowledge that failure at speed would be unsurvivable hung silently over every mission. By the late 1970s, the SR-71 was no longer a test program struggling to survive. It had become the most feared reconnaissance aircraft on Earth, a machine with a perfect combat survival record and a list of accomplishments unmatched by any peer. Yet even as it reached its peak, forces outside the cockpit were beginning to decide its future. Satellite reconnaissance was improving rapidly, budgets were tightening, and powerful voices were questioning whether the Blackbird's remarkable capabilities justified its enormous costs. But those debates belong to another chapter. For now, the SR-71 reigned supreme, a silent titan carving white contrails across the edges of the stratosphere, untouchable, unmatched, and unquestionably the fastest thing mankind had ever flown. Even legends must face the moment when the world around them begins to change. For the SR-71, that moment came not in a dramatic dogfight or a catastrophic failure, but in a far quieter place: government conference rooms, budget hearings, and classified strategy meetings where the future of warfare was being reimagined. The aircraft that once symbolized the absolute cutting edge of American aerospace technology suddenly found itself questioned, scrutinized, and, slowly, pushed aside by forces it could not outrun. The beginning of the end. By the early 1980s, the Blackbird was at the height of its operational power. Its cameras could read license plates from 80,000 feet. Its sensors could track missile launches across entire regions. Its flight path, Mach 3, above 24 kilometers, was still untouchable. In combat, it remained undefeated. No SR-71 was ever shot down, despite hundreds of missile launches. And yet, the very same decade witnessed a growing belief within the Pentagon that its future lay elsewhere, in satellites, in electronic intelligence, and in aircraft that required far less maintenance, money, and political risk. The SR-71 had become a paradox, too successful to ignore, too expensive to fully embrace. Each aircraft cost tens of millions to operate annually. Fully trained maintenance crews were aging and difficult to replace. Spare parts were scarce, requiring cannibalization of older airframes. And servicing the J-58 engines designed for an era that no longer existed, was a logistical nightmare. Even supporters of the Blackbird began to see the writing on the wall. The SR-71 was extraordinary, but it was also a relic of a strategic mindset formed during the early Cold War. The rise of the satellites. The strongest argument against the SR-71 came from new space-based reconnaissance systems. Satellites could stay aloft for years. They could photograph entire continents. They operated without pilots. They did not leak fuel on the runway or demand specialized tankers. They didn't require diplomacy to overfly other nations. To many policymakers, satellites seemed like the perfect replacement, but operators in the field knew better. Satellites followed predictable orbits. Enemies could hide equipment between passes. Cloud cover could ruin entire missions. And unlike the SR-71, a satellite couldn't suddenly appear over a crisis zone within hours. Still, in budget battles, logic did not always win. Even if satellites weren't perfect, they were politically convenient. And so, by the mid-1980s, a quiet campaign to retire the SR-71 had already begun. Internal politics and a divided Pentagon. The fight over the Blackbird's survival became one of the most contentious internal debates in modern Air Force history. Some generals saw the SR-71 as essential, especially those with backgrounds in reconnaissance. Others viewed it as a burden preventing investment in new stealth technologies. Supporters argued that satellites could never match the SR-71's flexibility. Opponents countered that U-2 upgrades could handle most missions at a fraction of the cost. And in the middle sat Congress, where committees questioned whether the SR-71 belonged to the future or to the past. What truly sealed the aircraft's fate, however, was the arrival of the next generation of reconnaissance tools. Stealth platforms, unmanned systems, and space-based assets were quickly reshaping the battlefield. The SR-71's philosophy, survive by speed and altitude, looked increasingly outdated in a world obsessed with invisibility and persistence. The official retirement. In 1990, after months of classified arguments, the Air Force formally retired the SR-71 fleet. Crews stood beside aircraft they had flown for decades, posing for photos that looked more like funerals than celebrations. Some of them openly cried. A few refused to believe it would really be the end. Then history played one of its cruelest tricks. Just months later, the United States found itself preparing for the Gulf War, one of the largest military operations since Vietnam. And suddenly, without warning, commanders realized the surveillance gap left by the Blackbird's absence. Satellites were too predictable. U-2s were too vulnerable. Tactical reconnaissance aircraft didn't have the range. What they needed, desperately, was an SR-71. But the program had already been shut down. Hangars emptied, crews reassigned, logistics teams dismantled. The world's fastest reconnaissance aircraft had been retired at the exact moment it was needed most. A brief resurrection. Under intense pressure from both Congress and military leadership, the SR-71 program was resurrected in 1994. 3 aircraft were returned to service. Crews reassembled. Maintenance teams retrained. And for a brief period, the Blackbird soared again. But it was not the same. Funding was inconsistent. Support from inside the Air Force was lukewarm. Many within the Pentagon saw the restart as a political gesture rather than a strategic necessity. Missions were rare, and in truth, the world was changing too quickly for the SR-71 to catch its place again. Satellites became more flexible. Stealth aircraft matured. drones emerged from experimental curiosities to real tools of war. The Blackbird's second life lasted only until 1998, when the program was canceled for the final time. NASA and the last flight NASA continued to operate two SR-71s for high-altitude research, testing propulsion concepts, evaluating atmospheric models, and supporting experimental aerospace technologies. For scientists, the Blackbird was not a weapon, but a laboratory, a machine capable of reaching flight conditions that no other aircraft could replicate. Yet even NASA eventually acknowledged that supporting the SR-71 was unsustainable. By the late 1990s, parts scarcity and rising costs made operations impossible. In 1999, the final Blackbird was grounded forever. After more than 3 decades, after thousands of missions, after rewriting every rule of flight, the world's fastest aircraft silently rolled into history. Legacy of a Titan today, SR-71. Blackbirds rest in museums, silent, motionless, impossibly sleek. Visitors stand beneath their wings and sense an almost mythical presence. The aircraft looks futuristic even now. Its lines are sharper than most modern jets. Its technology remains partly classified, and its records, speed, altitude, endurance, still stand unchallenged. What makes the Blackbird remarkable is not just what it did, but how it did it. It outran every missile ever fired at it. It mapped continents before satellites could. It turned the impossible into routine. And it symbolized an era when engineering was limited not by imagination, but only by physics. Even today, aerospace engineers study its design not with nostalgia, but with respect. Some whisper about rumored successors, hypersonic platforms with code names like Aurora or SR-72, but none have ever been confirmed. And none have ever flown in the open skies the way the SR-71 once did. The Blackbird remains unmatched. A machine that lived at the edge of Earth's atmosphere. A machine that defied heat, friction, and time. A machine that served without ever losing a crew to enemy action. A machine that proved mankind could build something that bordered on the supernatural. In every sense, the SR-71 was more than a reconnaissance aircraft. It was a statement that speed matters, that courage still counts, and that for a moment in history, humanity reached for the sky and discovered it could go faster, much faster,